July 26th, 2026, and there's a genuinely strange story unfolding right now involving the most recognizable airplane on the planet, and almost nobody's covering the part that actually matters. Everybody's talking about the paint job. Everybody's talking about the price tag. But almost nobody's talking about the fact that the President of the United States currently does not have a fully secure airplane, and hasn't for months, and won't for years. Let that sink in for a second. The plane that's supposed to be flying fortress secure, hardened against nuclear blast, immune to electronic snooping, is currently a patchwork situation involving a 35-year-old jumbo jet, a gifted luxury airliner from a Gulf monarchy, and a Boeing program that is now officially 4 years behind schedule. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is coming straight from Air Force statements, congressional testimony, and multiple independent reports. So let's actually get into what's going on, because the real story here isn't the color scheme. It's a mess of cost overruns, counterintelligence risk, and a political gift that may end up being one of the strangest arrangements in the history of the presidency. Here's the setup in plain terms. Back in 2018, Boeing signed a contract, personally pushed through by President Trump during his first term, to build 2 new presidential aircraft based on the 747-8 airframe. These are designated the VC-25B, and they're meant to replace the current fleet, the VC-25A jets, which have been flying since 1990. Think about that for a second. The airplanes currently protecting the President of the United States entered service the same year Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. That's how old these things are. They still work. They're still considered extremely safe because of decades of maintenance and upgrades, but mechanically and technologically, we're talking about jets that are pushing 40 years old by the time any replacement actually shows up. The original contract was worth just under $4 billion. Boeing was supposed to deliver the first replacement jet by 2024. That deadline came and went. Then it slipped again and again. And, as of the most recent Air Force statement, the new delivery target is now mid-2028, which puts the program a full 4 years behind its original schedule, with the total contract value now sitting above $5 billion. And here's the part that should make you raise an eyebrow. Boeing isn't just late, they're bleeding money on this thing because the contract is fixed price, meaning Boeing eats every dollar of overrun instead of passing it to the taxpayer. Boeing has already recorded more than $2 billion in losses tied directly to this program. $2 billion in losses on a $4 billion contract. That's not a rounding error. That's basically Boeing paying the government to take these planes off their hands at this point. And the reasons for the delay read like a checklist of everything that can go wrong in a massive defense conversion project. COVID disruptions early on. Workforce shortages, because turning a commercial airliner into a flying nuclear command post with secure communications, missile defense systems, aerial refueling capability, and specialized electronics requires a very small, very specialized workforce, and there just aren't that many people on the planet who know how to do this kind of work. Add supply chain problems, added requirements from the Air Force along the way, and you get exactly what we're seeing now, a program that's basically become the reference case study for how not to run a defense acquisition. Boeing even brought in a new program lead earlier this year, an executive with experience on the B-21 stealth bomber program, specifically to try to get this thing back on track. It tells you how seriously they're treating the turnaround, and it also tells you how badly it needed fixing. So that's problem number 1, a multi-billion-dollar jet that's years behind. Now here's where it gets genuinely wild, because instead of just waiting around, the administration found what looked like a shortcut. In May of last year, the government accepted a gifted luxury Boeing 747-8 from the government of Qatar. This aircraft is estimated to be worth around $400 million, and it was originally built as a private luxury jet for Qatari royalty. The plan was to convert this aircraft into an interim Air Force One to bridge the gap until the actual VC-25B jets are ready. On paper, that sounds efficient. Why not use a nearly new jumbo jet sitting around instead of waiting years for a totally new build? But this is exactly where the story stops being about efficiency and starts being about serious questions that almost nobody in the mainstream conversation is actually sitting with. Before we get into exactly what those questions are, if you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and hit like on this, drop a comment with your take, and subscribe if you haven't already. Because we're about to get into the part of this story that barely gets any coverage at all, and it's honestly the most important part. So let's talk about the gift itself, because accepting a $400 million aircraft from a foreign government is not something that happens in a vacuum. The moment this gift was announced, you had lawmakers from both parties raising alarms, and not just as a political talking point, but over genuinely serious constitutional and security issues. The Constitution has something called the Foreign Emoluments Clause, which restricts federal officials from accepting gifts from foreign governments without approval from Congress. The administration's answer to this was that the aircraft was being given to the United States Air Force and the Department of Defense, not to the president personally, so the emoluments concern didn't apply. Legal experts pushed back hard on that framing, arguing it wasn't nearly that simple, especially given reports that, after use, the aircraft would eventually be transferred to the president's future presidential library. Sit with that for a second. A gift from a foreign government, converted using taxpayer money, used for years as Air Force One, and then ending up as the property of a private presidential library. If that doesn't raise a conflict of interest question in your mind, I don't know what would. Then there's the security side of it, and this is where it gets even more interesting because this isn't political noise, this is coming directly from intelligence professionals. The top Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee said flatly that using this jet as Air Force One would pose immense counterintelligence risks by granting a foreign nation potential access to sensitive systems and communications. A former CIA field operative was even more blunt about it publicly, calling the whole arrangement a counterintelligence nightmare, and pointing out that verifying a foreign-gifted aircraft is completely free of surveillance devices is basically an impossible task. He actually referenced the Cold War-era U.S. Embassy in Moscow, which had to be stripped down to its bare structural frame because Soviet intelligence had planted listening devices throughout literally every room during construction. That's the scale of paranoia you need when a foreign government builds or gifts something that ends up housing sensitive American communications. And remember, this isn't some random foreign government we're talking about. This is Qatar, a nation that has walked a genuinely complicated diplomatic tightrope for years, maintaining relationships with Washington while also facing scrutiny over financial ties to groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Even lawmakers who are usually aligned with the administration publicly said this raised, in their words, significant espionage and surveillance problems. When you've got senators from opposite ends of the political spectrum, both waving red flags on the exact same national security concern, that should tell you this isn't just partisan noise. That's a signal worth paying attention to. Now, the administration's counter-argument has consistently been pretty simple, and honestly, it's not a crazy argument on its face. Why turn down a free airplane worth hundreds of millions of dollars when the alternative is Boeing dragging its feet for years? The president has said publicly that refusing a gift like that would be a foolish move, framing it as basic common sense. And look, there's a logic to that. If somebody offers you a practically new luxury vehicle for free while your current car is decades old and in the shop constantly, most people would at least consider it. But a car isn't a mobile command center capable of coordinating a nuclear response in a crisis. The stakes here are categorically different, and that's exactly the gap between the sales pitch and the actual complexity of what's involved. And that complexity is the part almost nobody is walking through in detail. So let's actually get into it, because this is where the real story lives. Converting a civilian luxury 747 into a legitimate Air Force One is not like swapping out seats and slapping on a new paint job. The current Air Force One fleet, those VC-25A jets from 1990, are hardened against electromagnetic pulse, meaning they're built to survive and keep functioning even after nuclear detonation, which would fry the electronics of basically any ordinary aircraft in the vicinity. They have secure, encrypted communications equipment that lets the president maintain command and control of the military from the air under any circumstances, including a full-scale nuclear exchange. They have onboard medical facilities capable of operating as a trauma center. They have defensive countermeasure systems designed to detect and confuse incoming missiles. They have their own baggage and cargo handling systems, their own stairs, their own fuel systems that allow in-flight refueling, so the plane theoretically never has to land. All of that has to be engineered into the Qatari jet if it's going to function as a genuine survivable presidential aircraft, rather than just a fancy plane with a paint job that says United States of America on the side. The government brought in L3 Harris Technologies, a major defense contractor, to handle exactly this kind of overhaul. And here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. Multiple reports citing defense experts have put the potential cost of fully converting this aircraft to genuine Air Force One security standards at up to $1 billion. And the timeline for doing it properly could stretch out for years. So think about what that actually means. The entire justification for taking this jet was to bridge the gap faster and cheaper than waiting for Boeing. But if the full security conversion takes years and costs up to $1 billion, you have to ask the obvious question. What exactly did the shortcut actually save? And in the meantime, what is the president flying in? Because here's the honesty check nobody wants to sit with. Reports from major outlets, including the New York Times, have indicated that in its current state, the retrofitted Qatari jet lacks the same security countermeasures the older Air Force One planes have, including anti-missile defense systems. Think about that. The interim solution to the delay problem is currently, by multiple accounts, less defended against an actual missile threat than the 40-year-old jet it's supposed to be replacing. And we saw the practical consequences of that play out in real time. When the president traveled to a NATO summit in Turkey earlier this month on the way home, instead of flying the entire route on the new Qatari-based jet, He flew part of the journey on the old VC-25A before switching planes, reportedly on the advice of the Secret Service, specifically because of heightened tensions with Iran at the time. The White House framed it as an opportunity to let troops at a British airbase see the new aircraft up close. Maybe that's part of the story. But when you line it up with the reporting that the Secret Service recommended the switch out of caution, and that this happened during a period of active hostility with a country that has already demonstrated ballistic missile capability, it starts to look less like a scheduling choice and more like an operational security decision. People have started jokingly calling it Scare Force One instead of Air Force One, and honestly, given everything we just walked through, that nickname is doing a lot of work. So where does that leave things right now in the actual present moment? The Qatari jet has reportedly been used domestically, and the administration has said it's been through significant upgrades, with officials describing the security posture as high level, even while acknowledging further work is ongoing. But there have also been reports that at points the plane was effectively grounded or restricted from certain international travel, amid concerns it wasn't yet meeting full security requirements. Meanwhile, the actual replacement jets from Boeing are still sitting years away, now targeted for mid-2028 at the earliest. And even that date comes with a caveat from Boeing itself, which stated in a recent securities filing that the contract terms would likely need to be finalized and the schedule reset again sometime this year, with the explicit warning that additional losses and potential further delays remain a real risk going forward. So if you're the type of person who reads between the lines of a corporate filing, that sentence is basically Boeing telling investors, don't be shocked if this slips again. And here's a detail that really shows just how much the Air Force is hedging its bets on this whole situation and actually working out on schedule. Separately from all of this Qatar jet drama, the Air Force has also gone out and purchased 2 additional 747-8 aircraft from Lufthansa, the German airline, for around $400 million, specifically to support the future Air Force One program. These aren't going to become presidential aircraft themselves. They're meant to provide spare parts and additional training capacity. Because remember, the 747-8 airframe isn't currently in mass production for passenger use anymore, so sourcing spare components down the line could become its own logistical headache. The fact that the Air Force felt the need to go out and buy backup commercial jets just to keep this program's long-term maintenance pipeline alive tells you everything about how much confidence there actually is in Boeing hitting its dates cleanly. When you're buying insurance policies against your own primary program slipping, that's not exactly a vote of confidence. Now, before we get into where the rest of the world sits on this exact issue, if this kind of deep dive is the sort of content you actually want more of, this is exactly the moment to drop a comment telling us what you think about the whole Qatari jet situation, because the split on this one is genuinely interesting. Some people see it as a smart, cost-conscious move given how badly Boeing has bungled the original contract. Others see it as an enormous unforced security risk wrapped in a shiny gift box. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because we're going to keep tracking this story as it develops, and there is clearly a lot more to come. Let's zoom out for a second and put this in a global context, because this is where things get genuinely interesting. And it's a comparison almost nobody makes. Most countries that operate dedicated head of state aircraft don't accept them as gifts from foreign governments with complicated regional interests. Germany's chancellor flies on Luftwaffe-operated Airbus jets built and maintained through NATO-aligned European industrial partners. The United Kingdom actually spent years debating whether to even have a dedicated royal and prime ministerial aircraft at all, largely because of cost concerns, before eventually converting an existing Airbus into a limited-use VIP jet. And even that decision faced heavy public criticism over the price tag. Russia's presidential aircraft, the Ilyushin Il-96, is domestically built specifically so the Kremlin never has to trust foreign avionics or foreign-sourced hardware anywhere near its head of state's flying command post. China operates its leadership transport using domestically produced and controlled aircraft for the exact same reason, keeping the entire supply chain sealed off from any potential foreign interference. You're noticing a pattern here, right? Nearly every major power treats head of state transport as something you build or control entirely in-house, specifically because the counterintelligence risk of an externally sourced aircraft is considered too dangerous to accept, gift or no gift. The United States, at least for this interim period, has become something of an outlier by accepting a foreign-sourced aircraft from a government with its own complicated set of regional relationships, no less, and attempting to retrofit it into a secure asset after the fact, rather than building that security in from day one. That's not a small distinction. That's the difference between building a vault from scratch versus buying a used safe and hoping nobody already knows the combination. And that brings us to what I think is the actual strategic read on this entire situation, because when you step back from the news, cycle noise about paint schemes and gift controversies, there are really 3 separate storylines tangled together here, and each one carries its own weight. The first is a genuine defense acquisition failure. Boeing's inability to deliver on a fixed-price contract, 4 years behind schedule and billions over budget, is a serious institutional problem that goes well beyond this one program. It raises real questions about whether fixed-price contracts even make sense for this kind of highly specialized, low-volume, extremely technical government work, because when a contractor is losing money on every unit produced, that creates its own incentive problems around cutting corners or deprioritizing the program internally in favor of contracts that are actually profitable. The second storyline is the emoluments and ethics question, which isn't going away just because the plane already landed. The idea of a foreign government gift eventually ending up as an asset tied to a presidential library, after being modified using hundreds of millions, potentially up to $1 billion of taxpayer funds, is the kind of arrangement that historians are going to be picking apart for decades, regardless of which side of the political aisle you sit on. And the third storyline, the one that actually matters most in the here and now, is the operational security gap. Right now, today, the President of the United States is flying on hardware that, by multiple credible reports, doesn't yet match the defensive capability of the aircraft it's meant to replace, during a period where global tensions, including active hostilities involving Iran, are anything but calm. That's not a hypothetical risk sitting years down the road. That's a live, present-day gap in one of the most sensitive pieces of national security infrastructure that exists. So when you put all three of those pieces together, what you get isn't really a story about a cool new airplane with a different color scheme. It's a story about an institution, the entire chain of defense procurement and presidential security planning, having to publicly improvise in real time because the primary plan failed to deliver on schedule. And improvisation, even well-intentioned improvisation, always carries risk that a fully planned, fully tested system doesn't. Whether that risk is acceptable, given the alternative of an aging 35-year-old fleet, is a genuinely fair debate to have. But it's a debate that deserves way more scrutiny and way less surface-level coverage than it's actually getting right now. There's also a longer-term angle worth thinking about here, which is what this entire saga says about America's broader defense industrial base. The reason this program is dragged on so long isn't really about incompetence and the way people casually toss that word around. It's about the fact that the specialized workforce capable of doing this kind of extremely niche, extremely secure aircraft conversion work has shrunk dramatically over the decades since the original VC-25A jets were built back in the late 1980s. You can't just hire more engineers off the street to work on a flying nuclear command center. The people who know how to do this kind of integration work are a genuinely small, genuinely specialized community, and rebuilding that capacity after decades of it not being needed at scale takes real time, no matter how much political pressure gets applied. That's a lesson that extends well beyond this one aircraft program, and it's honestly one of the more underappreciated national security stories of the decade, the slow erosion of niche defense manufacturing capability across multiple sectors, not just presidential aircraft. So where does this actually leave us as of today, July 26th? The Boeing jets are targeting mid-2028, with Boeing itself openly flagging that the schedule could shift again once contract terms are finalized later this year. The Qatari jet is in active use for at least some presidential travel, undergoing continued upgrades that could stretch on for years and cost up to $1 billion to reach full security parity, while reports continue to surface about gaps in its current defensive capability. And the ethics questions around the entire gift, from the emoluments clause concerns to the eventual presidential library transfer, remain very much unresolved and are almost certainly going to end up in front of courts, watchdog groups, or congressional oversight committees at some point down the line. This is very much a live, ongoing situation, not a closed chapter, and it's one that's going to keep generating headlines for years given how far out that 2028 target actually sits. What's your actual take on all of this? Do you think accepting the Qatari jet was a smart, pragmatic move, given how badly Boeing has fumbled the original contract? Or do you think the counterintelligence risk and the ethics questions around it make this one of the more questionable arrangements involving the presidency in recent memory? Let me know exactly where you land in the comments below, because the split on this one is genuinely fascinating to watch play out. And if you found this breakdown valuable, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who'd find this interesting, and subscribe so you don't miss the next update. Because with a 2028 delivery target that already comes with its own built-in warning label, you can be pretty confident this story is far from over.